Welcome back. You're watching The Globe here on SABC News Channel. We continue looking at the issue of poverty on the continent, particularly in the Southern African region. The Southern African Customs Union, or SACU, comprising Botswana, Eswatini, Lesotho, Namibia and South Africa, under the spotlight as the world's most unequal region. That, according to a World Bank report on Southern Africa's inequality that was released today, based on the Gini coefficient, income per capita, South Africa, the largest country in SACU, is the most unequal country in the world, ranking first among 164 countries in the World Bank's global poverty database.
Botswana, Eswatini and Namibia are among the 15 most unequal countries, and despite recent improvements, Lesotho still ranks among the top 20%. Consumption inequality across the SACU region is over 40% higher than the averages for both sub-Saharan Africa and other upper middle income countries. Although there has been some progress, high inequality persists. Consumption inequality in SACU has been declining. The Gini coefficient for consumption per capita in the region fell from 68.7 during the 2000s to 66.5 in 2016. Botswana and Lesotho saw the most rapid declines, whereas inequality was relatively stagnant in Eswatini and South Africa. Urban areas, which have consistently been more unequal than rural areas, experienced a larger reduction in inequality. According to the report, at least 1/5 of overall inequality in SACU is explained by inequality of opportunity. The report says disparities at birth are a crucial driver of inequality in the region.
Right, let's delve into some of those issues. We're joined now by co-author of the report, Pierella Paci, who is practice manager of the Poverty and Equity Group of the World Bank, covering Eastern and Southern Africa. A very warm welcome to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Perhaps let's just first start with the period, the length of time over which you did the study, and why, as we heard from our colleague there, that Lesotho and Botswana declined most rapidly in terms of those inequality scales. Ms. Paci, can you hear us?
Thanks very much. Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can. You can go ahead.
Great. Perfect. So thanks very much for the question. So just the years on which we do the report are somehow affected by the availability of data, because we need very detailed household level. So it varies slightly from country to country, but overall I would say it's over the last decade. So it's about a period of about 10 years, ranging between 2012 and 2020. In some countries a bit less than that. So there's actually the year, as I said, is not the same, but I would say the decade is the past decade.
Okay. I've also found this very interesting, that when you actually consider the issue of race, the level of inequality doubles. Does that just only exist in South Africa, or is it across the board in the SACU area?
So unfortunately, we don't actually have data on race in all the countries. We definitely had data in South Africa, and they have similar data for Namibia. So I think it may, it's difficult to generalize, because we just don't have the data to be able to say that, which is partly why we qualify that by saying when this analysis is possible, then it clearly basically doubles the impact of prenatal conditions, so what we call the inequality of opportunity. And I can elaborate what inequality of opportunity concept, but that's where race come into it, because inequality of opportunity itself really is a measure of the amount of inequality that is due to prenatal characteristics, to characteristic in the womb and birth. So it's basically inherited conditions to do with the individual themselves, like gender, race, age, but also with the family that the individual comes from. So the parental characteristics, like parental wealth, parental education, but also the location where the person lives. So these are conditions on which the individual himself basically have no control over. And they reflect, as I was saying, just basically basic inequality you're born with. And in the case of the SACU countries, just accumulate with additional inequalities that you face later, or I should perhaps say unequal treatment that you receive later, to actually lead to the overall inequality in income that we experience.
So as you talk about those inherited conditions, inequality of opportunity, I want to talk about the issue of land ownership and what role that plays into it, particularly South Africa and Namibia. I believe they have unique circumstances.
That's absolutely a big issue. And to some extent, again, the information is more easily available for some countries than others. And also the amount of concentration of land in hands of few individuals very significantly across countries. But to us, at least, we're looking really at income inequality. So because of that, what the issues we're most concerned about is the issue of productivity of land, productivity in agriculture, which is one of the major reasons why the rural areas continue to lag behind urban area, and in fact, in some countries, increasingly so. Of course, there are many reasons why productivity in agriculture could be low. And I think obviously climatic changes, including drought and lack of water, it's an important issue. But also access to land, especially property rights on land, are equally important, because it's extremely difficult to make investment on land that you basically don't own. And in the countries for which we have information, the concentration of land in the hand of very few people is still considerably higher than we see in other middle-income countries. And therefore, it's basically in itself is a cause of what we consider to be low productivity in agriculture in the rural areas.
So your report does say that there have been some improvements in some of the countries like Botswana, Eswatini and Namibia. But can you just tell us what some of their distinctive inequality data is? I'd like to start with Lesotho, then Eswatini, and then we can go to Botswana if we can look at those.
I'm sorry.
So
you mean the information?
The information, because
the
obviously
inequality.
Yes, we're discussing this within the context of the inequality data. And I'm just saying, because we've been speaking a lot about South Africa and Namibia, perhaps let's look at Botswana, Eswatini and Namibia. And as per your report, the improvements that have occurred there.
So the biggest improvement has been in Botswana, and there's been also considerable improvement, some improvement in Lesotho and Namibia, but I think the biggest one is actually Botswana. And I think Botswana is probably the case where the factors behind this improvement are a little bit more clear. I think Botswana, at least initially, and I think things may have sort of changed in the most recent year with COVID and also with some of the climatic shocks, but in the initial years, I think Botswana has been globally one of the good examples on how to actually use natural capital to what we call disinvest, to utilize some of the natural capital to actually increase other forms of capital, like human capital and infrastructure, so sort of physical capital. And therefore, actually sort of being able to compensate for some of the factors that the innate characteristics that actually differ by providing a more equal food for everybody to work on and improve some of the conditions. I think as we the report shows quite clearly. There are these innate differences in characteristics that people are born with, but investment over time, over the life cycle of a person, can actually compensate for some of it. So probably the most important example that we're seeing is, that's easy to visualize, is actually investment in education. And I think from that point of view, Botswana has actually done reasonably well. Has also invested on a broad increase in infrastructure over the country, and that's actually allowed for more economic opportunity, for the economic opportunity to be more freely available across different income groups, but also spatially, I think, across different parts of the country. Lesotho is somewhat different, I think, in terms of the story behind it, because I think it's a combination of similar factors, so increase in education, starting from a very different level, to be honest, but increase in at least access to education, and the quality of education is an important factor that remains to be analyzed. But the access to education is definitely improved in Lesotho, but it's also to some extent the less sort of positive result from the point of view of the high-income groups. The high-income groups have actually benefit less in Lesotho than in some of the other countries, and in a way that's sort of compressed distribution of income. So it's, as I said, altogether it's a very different story from Botswana, but also less positive.
Just a final question. In terms of corrective policy making for these conditions, how much, and if at all, does politics play a role in all or either of these countries? I'm talking about the political party governance or even political party affiliation.
Oh, we haven't really looked at political party affiliation. That's something for which we have no information at all. What we have looked at is actually policies that, as they are implemented by the government. And in particular, we looked at two aspects of basically how the government themselves can affect the inequality. One of them is basically to taxes and benefits, and the other one is to expenditure in public service delivery. And so the public is on the point of view of taxes and benefits. I think actually all the SACU countries, especially the more unequal, actually do a reasonably good job in compensating for what are basically large inequalities in initial income by redistributing some of the income itself through benefit and through a pretty progressive system, a progressive taxation system and a much more pro-poor benefit system. And similarly, also in terms of service delivery. Service delivery is sort of definitely favoring the less well-off, much more so than it does in other middle-income countries. So I think in terms of policy, I think the government has actually done reasonably well, and they made a genuine effort to actually compensate for this, to its original inequalities. The challenge there is that, to some extent, this is not really sustainable, and it's not sustainable fiscally because of the cost involved in that, and as the discussion of the report clearly spells out, is also socially very risky because it really creates like two types of individual to some extent, the people that participate actively in the labor market and sort of get some benefit out of it, especially those that get benefit out of it, and others that don't, and somehow they're compensated in terms of income, as I say, so they can get some minimum consumption, but they continue to be basically isolated from the potential for economic improvement. It's also seriously, as the report discusses, and it was very much sort of pointed out today when we had a broader dissemination approach, it's also really limit considerably the prospect for growth in these countries. And that's because basically the ability to contribute to the economy, the ability to be productive in the economy doesn't follow the innate distribution of resources. It doesn't follow your parents' background. It doesn't follow what you are. There are people that are potentially variable across the distribution, and therefore not giving them the opportunity to benefit from that, it also means that the country themselves can't. So it basically leads to an over-utilization of those resources. Under-utilization of those resources.
It's okay. Thank you so much for your time. Pierella Paci, much appreciated, practice manager of the Poverty and Equity Group of the World Bank, covering Eastern and Southern Africa on that inequality report in the SACU region.